Data Skeptic is the official podcast of dataskeptic.com, bringing you stories, interviews, and mini episodes on topics in data science, machine learning, statistics, and artificial intelligence.
The story of opinion polls for predicting the U.S. presidential election arguably begins in 1936, when Literary Digest, based on a poll reportedly containing 2.4 million respondents, predicted that Alf Landon would get a 57% share of the vote against Roosevelt's 43%. However, the actual election results were 62% for Roosevelt against 38% for Landon. In the same year, George Gallup sampled only 50,000 respondents, but a demographically representative pool, and was able to predict the result for Roosevelt. Fast forward to the most iconic blunder in polling history, the famous photo of Harry Truman holding up the Chicago Tribune newspaper that says, "Dewey defeats Truman" in 1948, which of course was wrong. Virtually every public opinion poll indicated that Dewey would defeat Truman. Elmer Roper, at one point, announced that he was so sure Dewey would win that he wouldn't even bother reporting on the polls anymore. To pollsters and statisticians, the results of this election were a clear indication that something was methodologically wrong with the approach. Since then, methods were refined and have become more accurate.
In fact, opinion polling is constantly being refined in technique.
And the number of polls has grown as well. Today in the U.S., there's Gallup, Rasmussen, Quinnipiac, Bloomberg, USC/LA Times, Reuters, NBC, CBS, Fox, the list goes on and on. Most polls provide snapshots of people's opinions at a particular point in time. Other polls track opinions over time in order to determine if people's views remain stable or change. Top polling organizations employ statistical methods and data analysis to collect responses from the best representative sample of the American voting public. With that said, some practitioners treat polling as though polling is both an art and a science. In my experience, something is only an art and a science if you haven't gotten the science right yet. George Gallup once said, "Sampling public opinion is like sampling soup. One spoonful can reflect the taste of the whole pot if the soup is well stirred." The point is that a randomly selected sample of a population can be used to estimate the views of the entire population. But there's a big if there, if the correct methods are employed. A random sample is often taken from a pool of all possible telephone numbers. True random sampling is always difficult to achieve and can be more expensive and time-consuming. Bias exists everywhere, and all polls have at least one bias: participation bias. Because your sample could never create an absolutely perfect representation of the voting population, there will always be some sort of sampling error. Let us try to understand the notion of statistical significance intuitively. If you flip a coin and got 10 heads and no tails in a row, this result could be said to be a statistically significant evidence that it's a trick coin. While 10 heads in a row from a fair coin is possible, it's very unlikely, a statistical fluke. But suppose the result were 6 heads and 4 tails. You wouldn't conclude the data was generated by a trick coin. That's certainly a possibility, but there's a non-trivial chance that a fair coin would yield this result. But statistical significance alone doesn't tell the entire story. One also needs to consider effect size. The larger the effect is, the smaller the sample needed to measure that effect with statistical significance. It will take more coin flips to determine a coin which produces 55% heads is unfair than a coin that produced 95% heads. The more subtle the effect, like, say a presidential election, the harder it is to measure accurately. For the past few election cycles, it's become generally understood that a single survey can be noisy and/or biased, and that averaging across polls gives a better sense of the trend in public opinion. Forecasting models of aggregation like 538s and Real Clear Politics are marvels of increasing predictive power, and they work well to smooth out methodological concerns and small sample sizes, and allow the trends to emerge. A fundamental problem all election pollsters face is that there is an over-reporting of the intention to vote. Opinion polls are accurate only to the extent that this pool captures those who actually turn out and vote on election day. Typically, a pollster's best estimates of turnout, or the likelihood voter model, is based on historical trends, screening questions, and their own best guesses. Recently, we've seen a lot of opinion polls come under quite a bit of skepticism. But is that skepticism truly justified? The recent Brexit referendum comes to mind, and of course, the US 2016 presidential election. Did the polls, quote, get it wrong? This episode will unpack some of those details, explore a bit more about how the polls are conducted, and even entertain some alternate ways we might try and predict the election's outcome. So when we decided at Data Skeptic to focus on this topic of polling, you can see it's taken us a while to get the episode together, and there were no shortage of commentaries or ideas to cover, so I needed to bring in some help to get a really good episode together. I want to introduce to you two contributors that have helped me research a lot of this episode. They're going to help me here in a roundtable style fashion as we cover some of the highlights of what we uncovered. If you've been reading the dataskeptic.com blog this week, you know both of them already, but let me introduce these two contributors, both named Christine, so we're going to call them by C and K, which is the digit their names differ by. So Christine with C, why don't you introduce yourself first?
I'm Christine Zhang. I'm a data analyst and a writer based currently in LA. In 2016, I spent 10 months working with the Los Angeles Times data desk doing data analysis for stories. So it's certainly a very interesting time to be in a newsroom. And I've also worked in think tanks and done more academic type work as well. So definitely a data geek type of person.
Fantastic. And Christine with a K, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name is Christine. I'm a freelance journalist based in LA, writing about science and the environment. I'm also a science writer at Data Skeptic.
So thank you to both Christines. Reminder, we're going to go with C and K for this. So C, can you tell us a little bit about how 538 has responded to the outcome of the election and some of the claims that maybe the polls got it wrong?
What 538 does is election forecasting based on polls. They also add in other demographic variables in different types of forecasts, but let's just focus on the simplest version here. There are several different polling firms that do polls, like notably the USC LA Times poll, which we'll talk about later in this episode. So those are individual polls. Then you have people and places like 538 taking each individual poll and then putting them together into like a polling average. What 538 was saying, they had written an article called "The Polls Missed Trump. We Asked Pollsters Why." According to them, a lot of the state polls had gotten it wrong. But actually, on a national level, national polls were, in general, they were more accurate than they were in 2012 in measuring the popular vote. There's a larger polling error in Obama-Romney with regard to the polls on average nationally in 2012 than there was in 2016. So were the polls wrong in measuring what they set out to measure? Nationally, no. Statewide, yeah. Now we have to get from there, which again measures the popular vote at any given time, to a predicted probability of somebody winning an election. What we really want is how a candidate will fare in the electoral college. Like, what will the electoral college outcome be? And that's what the 538 forecast was, right? The 538 forecast was, what would the electoral college outcome be? In other words, who would actually win the election? Just for the record, 538 in their polls only forecast, which is their default forecast, right before Election Day, they had Hillary Clinton with a 71.4% chance of winning and Donald Trump with a 28.6% chance of winning. And the upshot had Clinton's chances at 85% and Trump's chances at 15%. You could say, because Trump won, they were wrong. You could also look at it in a more probabilistic sense. When you say something has a 30% chance of happening or a 15% chance of happening, it's not the same as saying something has a 0% chance of happening. Keep in mind, those two models, as far as I could tell from my research, those were the two major models that were different from the other major forecasting models, some of which had Clinton at like a greater than 99% chance of winning, or at least like a 90% chance of winning. So it's a very different thing to say something has a 1% chance of happening and a 30% chance of happening. And I think that there was some misunderstanding around the disparity in those two probabilities.
Yeah, so the presentation of the statistics is definitely a challenge. I think the average person may not know enough to really interpret the results when they're stated in the best possible way. It raises some questions about what's the role of a journalist in presenting these topics and how we describe the polls to readers and such. C, do you have any thoughts on that?
The role of journalism, in my humble opinion, is to present information in a way that is informative to the public, that has some use. I had a really interesting conversation with Idris Kaloun, who works on the data team at The Economist, about The Economist's forecasts of the French presidential election, the final round of which is coming up, and why The Economist decided to forecast the French presidential election, especially now when there's been so much talk about election forecasting and pushback against election forecasting.
Excellent. Let's go into that interview.
I think it's really fashionable to say, well, to throw your hands up and say, polls don't really tell us anything. They were wrong the last 2 times around. Why bother doing this? The really simple answer to that is that the alternative to trying to forecast the future without using quantitative means like polls is trying to forecast the future using basic punditry that really kind of bears no relation to what will actually happen. If we weren't trying to base what we thought might happen, our probabilities of what would happen based on the quantitative evidence, we would be regressing back to a situation where you have people say like, well, I attended a rally and, it was half full or it was really full and there was a lot of chanting slogans. And so therefore this means this candidate is under or overvalued. That has the benefit of not being falsifiable, basically. That is kind of the cover that it gives you. With quantitative estimates, what happens is that if you make a prediction, you are then held accountable to it. I'm a really strong proponent of using the available information that we have. And I think it's also important to understand what happened with the U.S. I think that people get very wound up in saying that the models were wrong. First of all, on the national level polling, which measures basically the popular vote, they were correct. They were exactly correct. They should within a percentage point. There was a bigger miss in 2012 than there was in 2016 in terms of the popular vote in the United States. And the reason that no one freaked out in 2012 was because the overall sign of the prediction was correct. What happened basically in the U.S. was that you had state polls that were wrong. And because of the quirks of the electoral college system where all votes are allocated, basically this allowed this chance to occur. And even kind of if we grant that the polls were wrong, I mean, you have 538 putting Trump at a 30% chance of victory. People don't think it's odd when a 12 seed upsets a 5 seed in the NCAA. But somehow they think that it's completely topsy-turvy if a 30% candidate, let's say, wins in 2016. So I think that there needs to be kind of a dose of reality given to this kind of theory that you'll see tossed around, and that's, I think, very popular, and unfortunately so. Journalism is supposed to be kind of seeking out the truth. If you have people who are willingly blindfolding themselves to a very successful and very useful measure of truth, I just don't think that makes sense.
So, Kay, you've done some good background research for us on where polling organizations get their data from. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Polls are usually designed to represent the opinions of a population. They're generally just snapshots of people's opinions at a particular point in time. So you need to get a representative sample. Pollsters generally divide their sampling methods into 2 types: those that are probability sampling methods and non-probability sampling techniques. The most popular way to conduct polls is through telephone interviews using probability sampling. So to select samples, pollsters get their samples through a procedure called random digit dialing. Random digit dialing ensures that telephone numbers are distributed properly by geographic location, and that even unlisted numbers that can't be found on telephone books, because those aren't often updated, are also included.
True. I'm not going to ask you to give your number on the air, but remind me what your area code is.
It's 510, Berkeley, Oakland area.
And I'm 312 for life myself. C, what about you?
908, which is New Jersey.
So 3 Angelinos, none of which would be polled for Los Angeles.
People tend to move around the country after they get their first cell phone number. That's like one of the major flaws of this method. Another popular method for sampling is non-probability sampling. One non-probability method that's used to approximate a random selection of the population is through quota sampling. The basic idea of quota sampling is a pretty good one. So you just force a sample to be a representative cross-section of the population by having each important characteristic of that population proportionally representative within the sample.
So we've heard that random digit dialing is the gold standard, but it's not the only way of measuring public opinion. The ubiquity of Twitter makes it an interesting potential opportunity. Kay, you looked into this. Can you tell us how some researchers are trying to predict the elections with Twitter?
So there's like different ways to look at Twitter data. One is just the number of mentions of a particular candidate or the number of accounts that talk frequently about a particular candidate. And that's separate from like looking at the sentiment analysis. Social media analytic organizations and researchers at universities have started looking into social media in general, like Facebook and Twitter. Twitter has become a popular way to measure public opinion. They do this by looking at several different features of Twitter data to make their predictions. For example, they look at the number of tweet mentions for each candidate, which has been found to have a high correlation with public opinion for some candidates. Other features include looking at the number of retweets mentioning one candidate and the number of Twitter accounts talking about each candidate. One social media analytic group analyzed a sample of tweets posted within a 2-week period just before the election using natural language processing techniques to understand the sentiment of Twitter users towards the presidential candidates. So the group found that the ratio of positive to negative sentiment towards Trump was higher than that of Hillary. They interpreted that as Trump had more supporters using Twitter. But to understand exactly how Twitter users were thinking about a candidate on certain political issues or societal issues, they used a probabilistic algorithm for topic modeling. That's called latent Dirichlet allocation. They used LADA to identify the most popular topics of discussion in tweets, as well as like what the majority sentiment was towards that particular topic. And the group found that the majority of the topics of discussion had a generally higher positive to negative sentiment for Donald Trump compared to Clinton. And that indicated that Twitter users in their study at this 2-week period were more critical of Hillary than Trump in those issues that they most cared about.
So that could just be a coincidence. I don't know that that's necessarily a predictor of the election. Easy in hindsight to say, well, people spoke more favorably on Twitter about Trump and he just so happened to win. Is this team making any claims about, the accuracy of their methods or their ability to predict the outcome?
They're hesitant to say that their data could have been used to point a Trump win. In general, social media analytic firms have conflicting claims regarding the use of Twitter data for predicting election results. For example, another group from Stanford used sentiment analysis as a possible indicator for predicting election results. They believe that there's still a long way to go to be able to capture the public trend and how people really feel about the real world through social media.
Yeah, I remain unconvinced here about the effectiveness that social media might play in the polling environment. Time will tell, I guess. Yeah, as soon as we introduce a Twitter-based poll, I predict a swarm of new bots as Goodhart's Law shows up and people try and skew that. But let's move on to a well-known poll, the famous USC LA Times poll, which some people have called the only poll that got the result correct. C, can you give us some background on that?
This was a very contentious poll all throughout the election cycle and even after the election. During the election, the USC LA Times poll was an outlier in the sense that it was the only major poll that consistently had Trump ahead of Clinton. And so that's why people after the election said that it was the only one that got it right. But that's not true because it had Trump as winning by 3 percentage points, but he actually lost the popular vote by 2 percentage points. So it was incorrect it didn't go in the right direction.
Or right for the wrong reasons.
Or did it correctly predict the election outcome? Yes. Did the way that it get there, was that right? No. I had a conversation with Jill Darling, who is the survey director of the Understanding America study at USC, and she was involved with the polling directly.
Well, excellent. Let's go to that interview.
Our poll was very different in a lot of different ways. It was an experimental poll. It had been piloted briefly in 2008 and then again for a whole pre-election season in 2012. And the reason that we call it experimental and consider it experimental is because it really does use techniques that are different than the sort of tried and true polling that everyone has been doing forever, which is often telephone based. If it's done right, it's maybe RDD, in other words, random samples of telephone numbers. So that's the traditional way of doing polling. Try and find out who's a likely voter. You ask them who they're voting for, and you publish the results results among either all registered voters, if it's too early to really do a good job of finding likely voters, or among likely voters when it gets closer to the election. So that's kind of the gold standard. It has been. There's a lot of other ways that people do polling. More recently, there are online polls, some with panels like GFK's, which started out as a big probability panel. It is still huge. It's a huge panel. Not so much as a probability anymore as it was. And then there are, like SurveyMonkey polls that are among people who take SurveyMonkey polls. And they're very large. And a lot of the researchers who use these kind of scraping polls like that one is, try to weight them to be representative of the voter electorate. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Really, the RDD, the random digit dialing, is still the gold standard for a traditional poll, or being done through a panel such as ours, where you have the ability to say that you have a probability sample. We know the probability that any person was selected to be in our sample, which allows us to use the statistics that we use to do the estimate. So for ours, where we depart from that, we have the gold standard sample. And then we have a different way of going about asking the questions. We use what's called a probability method, which means that we ask people to, rather than the categorical, if the election were held today, who would you vote for? We ask them to tell us the likelihood that they're going to vote in November. So that's a 0 to 100% likelihood that they're going to vote. And then we ask them to tell us on a also 0 to 100% scale, their likelihood of voting for that candidate. So there's a 0 to 100% likelihood of voting for Trump, Clinton, someone else. For example, if someone's a Trump voter, in a categorical traditional question, they're either going to be a Trump voter or a Trump leaner. In our way of doing this, they might be a 60% Trump voter, a 75% Trump voter, a 100% Trump voter, but they're going to be perhaps changing over time from a 60% Trump voter to a 100% Trump voter if something happens. They attended a rally and they're all fired up now, and they've gone from sort of tepid or not really sure to really thinking this is their guy. And if enough of those accumulate, you will see those changes in our estimates. I don't know, sort of maybe like a fever chart or something over time. We have, in that way, kind of a way of quantifying the level of certainty, maybe quantifying uncertainty, particularly important, I think, during early days of a campaign when people are still getting to know the candidates, they're still making up their minds. And so that's one really significant difference, actually two, because of our panel as well.
Oh, right, because you asked like a same panel of people.
What we did was we recruited from our 6,000 member panel. It wasn't 6,000 when we started, but we built it. We were actually building the size of the panel over that summer.
This is the Understanding America study?
It's the Understanding America study at the Center for Economic and Social Research at USC. So we recruited as many of those folks as we could. We got more than 4,000 people who said they would participate every week. That group of people were assigned randomly to a day of the week. So they knew they were going to participate, for example, on Tuesday every week of the run up to the election from July through November. We would send them the invitation and they would log in any time of day or night at their convenience. The way that we did it this time, including those three questions, were exactly the way that they did that at RAND in 2012. When it was extremely close, I think it really was the closest in the final estimate of all the polls there are. The sort of published accounts of it, 538.com had, I think the last one they took was 3 days out or something. But when you look at the very last one, they were very close. So we had a lot of confidence in, this method. It had performed very well under pressure. It was criticized at the time for being Obama-centric, to being too Obama. But it turned out that Obama did win, and they were vindicated at the time. This time, for the 2016 election, we did the same process. We put all of our data and our methods online. So we had researchers and analysts following along in real time with us in the estimates we were creating and our forecasting, including Nate Silver's group, who decided they were going to just basically put a +4 or +6, I can't remember which now, Clinton on top of it, all of our estimates, because they agreed with our weighting. We had folks at the Washington Post and the New York Times who were also doing analysis, and a couple of other folks who were as well.
It sounds like there's some amount of controversy around the weighting. What have other people who are studying the same thing said about it?
There definitely was a lot of discussion around how the poll was weighting its respondents. So Jill mentioned that one of the weighting factors was how people said that they voted in 2012. So Nate Cohn had written a piece about why he thought that that weight shouldn't be in the final weighting. That factor shouldn't be taken into account in the weighting. He also took it upon himself to reweight the poll, to take the raw data and apply different weights. And he came out with a piece in October about that, entitled How One 19-Year-Old Illinois Man is Distorting National Polling Averages. So it was his argument that if you took the raw data from the poll and you weighted it according to different things, like a generic set of demographics, rather than what the USC researchers did, you would get a result that was in favor for Clinton. I talked to Ernie Tedeschi, an economist in DC, who did the same thing. He took the data and he applied different weights, and he got a result at that time that was much more in line with the other polls.
Excellent. Well, let's cut to the interview with him.
So you have this survey of roughly 3,000 people that you continuously survey, and then you have to figure out how to weight them. What LA Times USC decided to do was in many cases very straightforward. They looked at census data and they said, okay, we're going to weight based on age, sex, race. In other words, we're going to come up with weights so that the proportions of an African-American 30-year-old who's married in this survey matches the same proportion of all African-American 30-year-olds who are married in the entire American population as well, or the entire adult population. That's very straightforward. And, you can quibble a little bit with certain things about how that's done, but that's a very non-controversial, I think, straightforward way of doing it. The one extra thing they did, though, was they weighted based on self-responded vote back in 2012. In other words, they asked everybody in their survey, how did you vote in 2012? Did you vote for Obama? Did you vote for Romney? Or did you vote for someone else? Or did you not vote at all? We know, obviously, the results of the 2012 election. We have actual data on that. So they constrained the way that they weighted their sample so that it matched the actual voting results in 2012. And this was the thing that raised a red flag for me as I was digging into the methodology, because there's a well-known phenomenon in survey response called winner bias, is the easiest way to describe it. Either because you forget or because you want to make it seem like you were on the winning side, you tell a respondent that you ended up going with the winner in the last election, even if you didn't actually vote for, in this case, President Obama in 2012. What I suspected that meant is that there were more people in the LA Times USC poll who said that they voted for President Obama than actually really had in 2012. So the way that I dealt with that was I started from square one. I said, all right, let's get rid of the weights that the LA Times USC poll is using in their official results. Let's strip those out and let's just make new weights. We'll use the current population survey, which you'll recall I said is the survey that the government puts out that, among other things, produces the unemployment rate. But it also has a richer array of demographic information and some economic information in it that we can use to make weights. We'll see what's available in the LA Times USC poll, and we'll just build new weights, sort of in the same vein that the LA Times USC poll did itself, but we won't include self-reported 2012 vote as one of the metrics. So that's a long way of saying this is not there needs to be a much more robust postmortem on which metrics to use, how to weight them, what the best ex ante, that is beforehand, way of thinking about weighting these variables is. Anybody can go back after the fact, exactly the right weights that will get us the outcome. But the real challenge, and this is why I don't give LA Times USC a lot of flack for this, they had a big challenge, which is they were starting this poll and they had to decide before they had even published a single result from their poll how they were going to weight it. And they had to stick with that weighting throughout the entire sample. And that's a challenge. That's tough to do. I don't want to minimize that. And in terms of urban versus rural, that could be the real salient metric here, that if they had just directly accounted for from the beginning, would have solved a lot of this out of consensus issue with the poll. And I may have just kind of gotten that right through a back door, implicitly rather than explicitly, by changing the income variable and by changing, by taking out the 2012 vote weighting. That may have effectively accounted for that urban-rural divide without actually putting in a variable for urban versus rural. So So I don't know. That's one of the many interesting questions coming out of the poll. And again, what's great about the poll is that everybody can answer those questions or analyze those questions because all of the data is public.
So I don't have my mind made up about this weighting stuff, but it does seem like a critical issue. Has the core USC team responded to it at all?
They were aware of Ernie's analysis and Nate Cohn's. They've applied their own weighting factors. They don't actually think it was what people say that it was that made the difference. They think that there was another factor that they didn't take into account, which was their oversampling of rural voters in their survey. And Jill talks a lot about that.
Oh, so let's go back to Jill then.
Here's the thing. It's either that they're lying or they don't remember. So that would be measurement error. Or when we go back to sample people who don't participate in elections may be less likely to participate in election surveys. So there's two schools of thought, and they require two entirely different approaches. If it's a sampling problem, in other words, we don't have those people in our sample, that means there's a coverage error. And what you do with coverage errors like that is you apply weights that compensate for that. So we make sure that we weight all of our samples to account for any biases for education, age, all of the typical things that everyone does in surveys. If you come down on the side of it being sample error, you would also need to apply that weight to account for the fact that we don't have those folks in our sample. There's not a lot of evidence, but there's some literature to show that people do differentially respond based on, number one, interest, and number two, sort of sensitivity or like issues with the subject. And in particular around elections, if there's an event that happens, you're going to have differential response based on whether that event was positive or negative for your candidate. If it was negative for your candidate, people are less likely to respond to a survey about the event. With those things in mind, we sort of came down on the side of sample error as opposed to the other side, which is where everyone else basically came down on, which is that it's measurement error, that people are either lying or they're misremembering, or there's just sort of a psychological tendency to remember, like if you really like Obama now, you're more likely to remember that you voted for Obama. We don't really have a ton of evidence about this. We do know that there is drift. We don't really know why that drift occurs. So we need more research on that, and that's definitely going to be a huge focus for us in subsequent elections that we do. But for the moment, our statistician, who's an econometrician and professor at USC, looked at the available evidence and realized that, if we came down on the side of sampling error, it would not only deal with the potential for differential non-response to the survey, but also differential non-response to any particular week, when you might have this issue come up where there's an event that's negative for the candidate. And so therefore we might have some differential non-response among our panelists who had agreed to participate, that it would also account for that as well. So that's what we did. And what it did was, because we had to stretch Republicans who voted for Romney in the past, because we had an overrepresentation of Obama voters and an underrepresentation of non-voters. We stretched the Republicans and we stretched the non-voters. And those two things combined, because more 2012 non-voters tended towards Trump, they stretched the Trump numbers. And if you didn't do that, you got numbers that look a lot like the numbers that everybody else was getting at the time, which all had Clinton ahead the entire time. So in the end, we really wondered, because we had this overstatement of the popular vote for Trump, was that really the problem? And we are finishing up our analysis of this now. But what we really have found is that no, that was not the problem. The problem was that we had an overstatement of urban voters. We had a bias towards urban voters that we were not aware of. I mean, not urban, I'm sorry, rural. That ended up really being it. And what we're looking at now is a variety of models that we're applying. And it really looks like what we're going to be doing is adjusting based on zip code population, which should take care of the issue for us. It's not a typical weighting variable. There hadn't been anything previously to tip us off to this bias in our election samples. So, I mean, it's really sort of interesting that we had that rural overstatement. We're looking into where it came from, what its sources are. The bottom line is once you make that adjustment, you end up with a 1-point Clinton lead or a 2-point Clinton lead, depending on which model you use. One model adjusts based on census designation of whether or not it's urban or rural, and the other one is just based on population and zip code. What we're going to do is once, our statistician is satisfied with the models, we'll need to run that against, we have the 2012 data that we can look at. Hopefully we can run a comparable model that we have for our casting estimate against that data and make sure that it's still working. We now have 2 big election samples to work with. So that's what our statistician is working on. He'll publish that data later this year.
Let's take a break from our show this week to discuss our sponsor, Periscope Data. If you haven't heard about Periscope Data in one of their previous sponsorships, it's a web-based tool made for data teams, enabling them to turn SQL into beautiful interactive dashboards to share with their entire company. It's a great tool for teams of any size and has some features that are really beneficial for large organizations. Many of the data science teams I talk to have internal metrics they look at, but also have a slightly different set of metrics for non-technical team members, which are often more interpretable. With Periscope Data, it's easy to build and maintain different dashboards for different teams. Maybe the most picky executive needs their own personalized custom dashboard. No problem. Their SQL views make it easy to reproduce results and plot them different ways, and their custom filters can enable users to tweak the data they're looking at. Why not consider Periscope Data for your company? Start a free trial today by visiting periscopedata.com/skeptics. Once again, that's periscopedata.com/skeptics. So it sounds like the jury may still be out there. I'm looking forward to that report. Keep an eye on the dataskeptic.com blog. We'll be sure to at least notify you about it, maybe with some thoughts when that comes out. So at least one researcher out there is looking at alternative ways we might predict the elections that don't necessarily involve opinion polling at all. Kay, you looked into Alan Lichtman's work. Can you tell us a bit about what he's been up to?
So Alan Lichtman's system, which is known as a Keyes model, it's based on the theory of pragmatic voting. According to this theory, America's electorate chooses the next president based on how well the incumbent party has been governing the country. This is all regardless of the events during the campaign season. His system gained some popularity in the last election because by September, he was predicting that Donald Trump was going to win the election. So there are 13 keys or scenarios. These 13 scenarios are stated as true or false statements. These things are like the incumbent administration affects major changes in national policy. True or false? There is no sustained social unrest during the term. True or false? The economy is not in recession during the election campaign. So there's 13 of these. So when 5 or fewer are false, the incumbent party is expected to win. And if there's 6 or more that are false, they predict that the challenging party would win.
Okay, well, I'll give you right away. It's probably going to do better than chance, but, what has this system done historically? Has it been accurate in predicting elections?
Alan Lichtman's model has actually been pretty good. He developed it in 1981, and he's been using it to predict the presidential elections from 1984 through the last one. But he hasn't actually been always correct in predicting the actual winner. For example, in the 2000 election, he wrongly predicted Gore would be the next president based on his system. And we all know he didn't win.
Yeah, that one's interesting. I mean, given the fact that the courts intervened in that one, maybe you have room to claim that the system worked, but that was an outlier for some reason. But what I'm curious about is these questions. He has more questions than actual election cycles since he started doing this. So at present, there's a little bit too many degrees of freedom. But where does he derive these from? How did he invent those 13 key questions?
Well, so interestingly enough, Alan Lichtman came across ideas for this particular prediction model after meeting a Russian geophysicist named Vladimir Kilis-Baruk. Lichtman and Baruk got talking about earthquakes and asked themselves whether elections might follow the same principles as earthquakes. Lichtman and Kilis-Baruk reinterpreted the U.S. political system in terms of geophysical terms of stability an upheaval. For example, stability would mean that the incumbent party would remain, but if there's upheaval, that would signal a change in the ruling party.
It's interesting. I don't know how to evaluate it except straightforward and empirically.
What's funny is that Keyless-Brooks' earthquake predictions failed, like they were actually not successful. But Alan Lichtman has been pretty successful in using this particular model for predicting election results.
Yeah, the earthquakes thing is a strange distraction to me, but if I take the system at face value, empirically we might say that Lichtman has a good streak of accuracy here. However, I really think some of these criteria he has are a little bit up to chance. Like, he lists the challenging party candidate is not charismatic or a national hero. I think that's, national hero maybe is something that we can get consensus on, but whether or not one's charismatic is rather a debatable choice, I think. I'm also reminded of some of these scams you see from stock market companies sometimes where they'll create a fund or they'll create mini funds and, put some arbitrary stocks in them, wait 5 or 10 years, and the funds that actually made a profit, they'll promote and tell people about how great they were and quietly forget about all the funds that lost money. So if you were to do this on random data, some fund will emerge as a good one. Certainly someone asking yes or no questions like this, someone will emerge with good predictions. There are things about Lichtman's line of reasoning that do seem to correlate with what the public would want, but yeah, I remain unconvinced here. But not so much so that I would dismiss Lichtman altogether. I'll take a look at this in the future.
Let's say you wanted to measure what something weighs. One method is to hang it from a spring and see how far the spring gets displaced. You can see machines that do that at most grocery stores. Place produce in the tray, and a dial spins which tells you what everything weighs. However, you're not actually observing the weight directly. You're observing the displacement of the spring and then converting that into a number. Now, if you trust that Hooke's law is an accurate description of the universe, and that you know a few details about the spring you're using, you can use those displacement measurements to determine the mass of the object. In other words, there's a procedure that converts displacements into weights. In the case of the grocery scale, the procedure is a well-established one from physics. But the procedure, when it comes to predicting an election's outcome, isn't quite as clear. Should you break down your poll respondents by demographic characteristics? Which ones? Should you estimate the voter turnout of each of those groups? It seems like all those questions should be answered with a yes, but it doesn't emerge from first principles. In September 2016, The Upshot gave 4 pollsters some raw data and got 4 different results, when asked to predict the election based on the common data set. The reason for this was that each group made unique and different methodological choices about how they would predict the outcome from the same data. It's like these 4 pollster groups were asked to measure something's weight, but all had different machines by which to do it. When conducting a scientific experiment, you need to isolate and control for as many variables as you possibly can. Sometimes variables don't affect an outcome and can be ignored. For example, I doubt whether a person's preferences to shower first thing in the morning or last thing before going to bed impacts their political affiliation. You can safely ignore that. But to measure a system effectively, you've got to identify and account for factors that can bias your data. The hanging grocery store scale could report the wrong weight if it was in the presence of an extremely strong magnet. However, that's not a realistic scenario worth considering. Small currents in the ambient air are also ever so gently pushing the scale up and down. The forces exerted in this way are so small, the cost variance is surely a fraction of a cent. For the most part, the reading on that hanging scale depends on one simple parameter, the actual. Polling is a form of measurement. Let me say that again with some dramatic emphasis. Polling is a form of measurement. People can measuring what exactly? Polls ask people some version of the question, who are you going to vote for? That's not actually measuring the outcome, reasons that may seem trivial to you. The thought process by which individual people select their candidate of choice can be as varied and individualized as how we decide what clothes to wear. When faced with an infinite number of dimensions feeding into a choice, pollsters implicitly do what many data scientists do: dimensionality reduction. They look for common factors with high predictive power like gender, race, income, and geography. Measuring just those is a calculated approximation. Pollsters have a much more complex system to model than the hanging spring. Their work is a lot harder. That's not an attack on the hardworking metrologists at grocery store scale manufacturing companies. I'm sure they'd tell me that there's a trade-off between accuracy and the cost of precision engineering. In the end, we can tolerate a pretty significant error when weighing our tomatoes. If the scale is within a tenth of a pound, I'm sure most people wouldn't even notice the error. But in the election, sometimes it all comes down to a razor-thin edge. You need a more precise measurement tool. Many listeners will recall the abandoned Florida presidential ballot recount in 2000. Ultimately, the outcome of that election was decided by our court system. That's a simple statement of fact. I'm not taking any position on whether or not things in Florida were handled in the perfect way. I'm just talking about history. To the best of my knowledge, no pollsters accounted for hypothetical court interventions in their forecasts. They're predicting some quasi-approximation for our actual system. If instead the manual recount had proceeded, there's still the possibility of human counters making errors due to exhaustion or just plain blunders. Remember all the discussion of hanging chads? There were certain physical ballots that human recounters could not agree on. Even if we could be sure these recounters were absolutely unbiased, they still might have arrived at different numbers counting the exact same ballots. In the case of the 4 pollsters arriving at different results from the same data, the root cause is differences in how they modeled the data. Here, not agreeing on the count of a stack of ballots is an error in measurement, not model. Even with infinite time, it likely would have been impossible to know the exact final counts of the Florida votes. The counting process has its own margin of error. Measurements get weird when you push them to extreme accuracy. I'm not just talking about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Metrology, the study of measurement, is maybe the nerdiest thing I'm interested in. I don't even tell most people about it because I don't think they'd understand why I like it. Metrology is very cool. It's more than just SI. I'm fascinated by the machines that we build, like LIGO. Its 4-kilometer twin arms are trying to measure distortions orders of magnitude smaller than the width of a human hair. I can barely cut a 45-degree angle correctly on my table saw. That sort of precision is almost unthinkable to me. But LIGO is able to do it because they trust, or at least are attempting to test, Einstein's theory of relativity. They have a very well-founded model upon which to interpret their data. So if every voter is a unique and beautiful snowflake, is all hope lost? Can the polls have any hope of reliably predicting the victor of an election? Of course. Nearly every long-running poll has performed better than random guessing. The question is really about the precision and accuracy of these polls. So let's break down the flaws that polls can have which would introduce error. I'm going to put these into 3 categories: sampling error, measurement error, and systematic error. 1. Sampling error. Polls can fail to capture a sufficiently representative sample of the voting population to obtain a statistically measurable signal from all relevant points of view. Maybe a well-funded poll can stratify across race, age, gender, sexual orientation, and all of the obviously relevant factors. But if, unbeknownst to that pollster, the next election has a candidate which resonates deeply with nearly all left-handed voters, the impact of that point of view is likely to go unnoticed. 2. Measurement error. How do you account for lying participants? What about sincere participants whose minds are changed between the time of polling and the time their vote is actually cast? How does a person of mixed race get classified when an apathetic poll questionnaire has to check one and only one box from a rigid list? The very measurement the polls make have a degree of implicit error. 3. Systematic error. Many polls are essentially trying to predict the popular vote. The popular vote is a thing that many people would be interested in hearing predictions about. However, it is not necessarily the same thing as predicting the actual winner of the election. As has been seen, one need not win the popular vote to be the victor in the U.S. election. That's not a criticism, it's an observation. Whether or not you like the Electoral College is not important. So long as that's our mechanism of selecting a winner, a diligent pollster needs to try and model the actual system at work. Polls must include some amount of model if they have any hope of achieving high accuracy. And ultimately, that model can't be as complex as the actual decision-making processes of all eligible voters. A poll is and always will be an approximation. Any decent poll has a model not just to account for the differences between the Electoral College and the popular vote, they also seek to capture useful knowledge not included directly in the poll results. When certain neighboring counties tend to vote in similar ways, that information can be built into a model. If the type of industry in a county has predictive power, you'd want to consider that. Shifting demographics are often relevant, although data on that is often slightly out of date since the census only updates every so often. It's no surprise that the upshot got different answers from different pollsters regarding the same data. Each of them made different choices about how to extrapolate an election result from the data provided. Polls are not right or wrong. They are simply measurements with varying degrees of sampling, measurement, and systematic error. The better ones go to great lengths to minimize these issues, but no poll can ever eliminate them. In the United States, votes are cast in secret. Yet we can conduct exit polls to try and measure the error in the pre-election polls. But the exit polls have many of the same issues discussed here. That's not to say that there isn't useful feedback in an exit poll with which a capable pollster can update their methodology. Surely there is. But as with machine learning, incremental improvements to polls has an upper bound based on the complexity of the system they seek to measure and the precision by which they're able to measure it. The idea of a perfect poll, just like the idea of a perfect measurement, is completely fiction. Like most things, polls output an approximation. Ideally, one with useful error boundaries, but in a world where the general public demands only a point estimate, conversations about the accuracy of polls are here to stay. Doing a good job gathering data and creating a prediction of an election outcome is far from a simple or easy task. For me, there are two important overarching takeaways. First, the smaller the effect, the harder it is to measure. Put another way, the closer the race, the less likely anyone can actually predict the outcome. Second, any decent poll is a statistical statement. A poll giving 70% advantage to one candidate means that if the election happened 10 times, they'd expect to win 7 out of 10. That can be a confusing idea, since running an election again is likely to bring out new voters and change minds. We need to think of that statement more in terms of hypothetical parallel universes or something. I'm not sure if that's any better, though. The point is, when statistics govern a system, we have to understand and accept the error bounds. This doesn't let recent pollsters off the hook for an explanation. However, we should examine and criticize the methodologies of the pollsters, not the outcomes. That's the path to a more robust mechanism for prediction.
I want to send a special thanks out to Christine Zhang and Christine De Leon, who both helped research and co-write this episode with me. We're also grateful to Idris Kaloun, Jill Darling, and Ernie Tedeschi, who were gracious enough to be our guests for this episode. All this past week, and probably a few days next week, we've been posting extra supplementary material related to the show that just didn't quite make the cut on the dataskeptic.com blog. Some things required visuals, and some things didn't fit, so go check out all the extra material there. While you're at dataskeptic.com, be sure you sign up for our mailing list. You can do that on the home page in the little box where you just add your email address. Now, we send out cool newsletters, but besides that, we're about to release the Data Skeptic bonus feed. That's going to be this alternate release of extra content. For example, the 3 interviews that Christine did are going to appear in their entirety there. So if you liked what our guests were saying and you want to hear the fuller story, that's going to appear in the bonus feed. We're also going to drop in some, fun extras and surprise things from time to time. So you definitely want to get on that. The only place we're going to announce that is in the mailing list. So get on the mailing list this week, and we'll shoot you an announcement soon telling you how to get our bonus feed. Please leave your thoughts and ideas about polling and the measure of presidential elections in the comment sections at dataskeptic.com for this episode's post. We'll see you again next Friday when we talk about generative adversarial learning. And between now and then, I want to remind everyone to keep thinking skeptically of and with data.
Data Skeptic is a listener-supported program. To support the show, visit dataskeptic.com and click on the membership tab.